I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming online.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the characters and plot to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back
Relax
and enjoy Stream On. Today, we'll be reviewing Radium Girls, streaming on Netflix.
It is the 1920s. Joe and Bessie are sisters working in a watch factory. Every day they use radium-based paint to eliminate watch faces while exposing themselves to toxic levels of the radioactive material. When Joe becomes sick, Bessie starts down the path of social activism, wanting to hold the company accountable for the sickness and death it is responsible for.
Radium Girls is directed by Ginny Moeller and Lydia Dean Pilcher. It's written by Ginny Moeller and Brittany Shaw, and it's based on the book The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women by Kate Moore, which is a true story of female factory workers in the 1920s who were dial painters using radium paint. The film stars Joey King as Bessie Cavallo, a 17-year-old factory worker, Abby Quinn as Josephine Cavallo, Bessie's older sister and also a factory worker, Kara Seymour as Wiley Stevens, the leader of the Consumers League of New Jersey.
So, Steph, why did you pick this movie?
So this is another one that was recommended to me. A coworker recommended it, and she said that it covers a little known topic from American history, which is why she liked it. And so I was interested. I also tend to like historical dramas, so figured I would give it a shot because it was streaming on Netflix.
So, Steph, why don't you get us into the plot analysis?
So, as a writer, I think it's important to make sure that you're choosing the right character as your protagonist. And this film didn't do that. They focus on the wrong lead character, who I'm calling Boring Bessie. And the reason she's not that interesting is that she's the one healthy factory worker. They make a point early on that she doesn't lick the brush that has the undark paint on it that has radium in the paint that ends up poisoning these girls and giving them throat and jaw cancer for unknown reasons. We don't know why she chooses not to lick it. It's not really explained. But she doesn't get sick because she doesn't lick the brush, and we focus on her as the heroine trying to bring down the evil corporation, American Radium, that is knowingly poisoning its workers. Because she didn't suffer the direct effects of radium jaw and her teeth falling out and her jaw falling out and her body basically shutting down and going through versions of necrosis, she's just not that interesting as our main hero. You instead could have used Josephine. So Josephine is Bessie's older sister, and she's like the overachieving, hardworking, smart older sister who does lick the paint, and she actually won most dials painted in a month, and as a reward got a bottle of Radathor, which is supposed to be radium, healing radium in a bottle. But she suffers the effects of her actions of licking the paint and goes through terrible necrosis. Like, she's sick all the time. Her teeth start falling out. It's really sad to watch. And she would have been a much more interesting point of view character to follow through her journey of trying to get justice on the company that has poisoned her and will kill her. But instead, they keep going back to Bessie. I mean, what are your thoughts, Jeff?
I agree with you completely. They focus on the wrong character. And I think that's because they wanted to have a subplot of an otherwise detached person becoming an activist. That is the only reason I can see them following Bessie, because there's nothing particularly interesting about her character. Joe, in the first act, actually is set up as the person you assume you're going to be following. As you said, she's smart. She kind of holds the family together. She seems to have more on the ball. She is interested in doing something else with her life. And then she is going to be suffering from physical deterioration, which is very dramatic. Why wouldn't you follow her? Do you have any other ideas as to why they'd focus on Bessie?
No, not really. I mean, it was really odd choice of direction for this film to go. And I- even the subplot they tried to give her with Walt, the relationship she formed with a boy that was a part of this, the artsy, communist underground party, right? That like it wasn't even needed. Like, it wasn't that interesting. You had a side character that was a girl that was a documentary filmmaker trying to expose, civil rights issues and this and that, which is not what this film is about. This film is not about civil rights issues with respect to, African Americans and all that. It's about a company trying to poison its workers, and you have enough material there to focus on that issue and workers' rights, that you didn't need to go into all these other like subplot areas that weren't relevant to the film.
I think the reason they did that, though, is to try to connect it with modern viewers. That a movie purely about the plight of these women who were knowingly poisoned because the companies involved in the historical incident knew that radium was toxic. They just didn't care. I think that the communists were put in for two reasons. One was that connection with modern audiences, and two, I think some of it was so that you didn't just have a bunch of white people having their story, because they shoehorn in particularly the Etta character, who is introduced when Bessie goes to this meeting of the Communist Party with her prospective boyfriend, sits next to Etta, and proceeds to be subjected to basically a sloganeering harangue that makes her out to be, her being Etta, the kind of person you never want to talk to at a party. I had the impression that the writers actually didn't particularly like the activists because they come across as kind of annoying, sloganeering bores. So the more time spent with them, the worse it is for the movie when you have this extremely important and not well known story that led to a whole host of changes in worker safety laws.
It just really missed the mark on that subplot and in choosing to focus on Bessie. Like, one point I thought, well, maybe the whole reason they're doing that is to somehow get Bessie and Josephine connected with the Consumer League, and that's where Bessie gets the lead to talk to Wiley of the Consumer League, is from that party. But she could have found it. They're smart. Josephine's a smart girl. They set her up to be super smart. She could have found that lead in a bunch of other ways versus needing this Communist Party subplot. And Josephine, because the doctor tells Josephine she has syphilis, and Josephine knows she doesn't because she's a virgin. And so Josephine's trying to figure out like why she is having all these symptoms, and Bessie's trying to figure it out too. So there could have been a lot of different, you could have had a research montage scene or something, just bringing together other girls that are former employees and having, them talk through it and say, hey, I was told syphilis too. Everyone seems to be told they're getting syphilis by this one doctor, as a reason to describe all their symptoms. Maybe there's, and I was a virgin too, or whatever, right? Like, maybe there's a connection. Could have done that a lot of better ways than how this film did it.
Well, and when you're telling a story, that is important. And, you know, really for people who aren't writers, it might seem obvious which character is going to be your lead. It's not always. For example, the novel I'm working right now, a character that originally had been conceived of as a one chapter throwaway. Well, as I was writing her, she was becoming more interesting, and now she's like one of the main characters. So, characters in the creative process can become more interesting as you develop them and see things that you didn't see initially. The problem with this story is that they took the interesting character, and by the second act, she's background. And it's not satisfying. And it's one of the worst things about this movie. And there are other bad things about this movie, but that choice of protagonist weighs this whole thing down.
Yeah, and then they give her like this pseudo attempt at depth towards the end where she does this weird voiceover and reads an excerpt from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Why? I don't know. They're just trying to give her substance, Josephine's character, towards the end. It's so melodramatic, and in either character that would have been strange, but it would have made more sense for Bessie to do the Egyptian voice of the dead voiceover part because she was the main character at that point. Than having Josephine do it is a sad attempt to give her more depth towards the end when they hadn't been focused on her.
This may seem nitpicky, but this actually has to do with the interest in Egypt. In the first act, it seems like that's Josephine's thing. And that's kind of what sets her apart. She has an academic mindset while Bessie seems more interested, in hooking up with boys and stuff. But then by the second act, it's apparent that they both have an interest in Egyptology, although Bessie, at one point, says she doesn't know what the word exhumed means, which, if you're reading a lot of history books on the exhumation of Egyptian tombs, you probably know what that word means. But it goes back to this idea that they had the natural protagonist, but as they went on, Bessie became it, and it's almost like they started porting over some of the character traits they initially had set up for Joe.
I picked up on that too. It's like, oh, Josephine's too sick to be the protagonist. She's sick, losing her teeth. We might as well give it to Bessie. Like they just sort of lost the way. And there's another scene at the end. It's the arbitration scene where they're finally doing the settlement with the lawyer and they're getting their money and this and that. And they, in essence, win the case. And so Bessie is the one that's angry about the whole thing. Instead of Josephine being the one to be angry and riled up over it, it's Bessie. And she's like, so this is how it ends? Just they write a check. And Wiley says, I'll tell you a secret I learned a long time ago. It never ends. Which, I liked that line because it's true. I mean, we have companies still getting away with things and poisoning the environment today, right? We still have these issues going on. They haven't gone away. So I thought that was a good line, but it was like Bessie got to have that moment instead of Josephine. And Josephine, being more wronged in this whole thing, should have been the one to have that. So this is how it ends line.
One of the related issues with this movie is how they treat it as a message about social activism, where the primary purpose is to make a statement, which is, to me, clearly what this movie wanted to do. It wanted to fill us in on a lesser known part of American history and part of labor history, but also to tie that into modern activism in a way that you can say these women 100 years ago were, precursors to the civil rights and social justice crusaders of the decades that followed, which is fine. That's nothing wrong with that as your theme. But it seemed to me like the writers lost track of how to do that in an effective way.
You get that in the postscript. The movie ends with a postscript that I actually liked. The postscript, it talks about how the judge who negotiated their $10,000 settlements that these ladies got for the New Jersey factory to be shut down owned stock in the company, that radium paint was still used on dials until the 1970s. So even though that factory had to shut down, it still existed in others. That their case did have a lasting impact on labor laws. So it did tie in historically to future people's working conditions. That postscript left you with what the film was trying to say.
That's true. I just am not a fan of using postscripts to wrap a story up. One thing I would like to bring up is the use of film clips from the era this is supposed to be taking place. It's an odd stylistic choice and one I don't think works very well. We are first exposed to the use of period clips at the beginning. You get like basically a montage that's supposed to show, it's creating a setting for the film. But then every 10, 15 minutes, you get more of these clips. And not all of them seem to be even germane to what's happening. There's some clips of girls dancing and stuff. And it's like, what does this have to do with anything?
It's like, let me just remind you that you're in the 1920s. I'm going to plop some clips in to make sure our viewer remembers they're in the 1920s and not in modern day America.
I assume you'd agree it was completely unnecessary.
I hated it. It was so distracting. It just pulled you out of this already troubled film.
That can be done successfully. That being using period clips to set a mood, create a tone. The best example that I can think of at the top of my head is the opening to the science fiction movie Soylent Green, in which, over this course of the first 2 minutes of the movie, you get a series of still photos and a musical score that keeps in time to what you're seeing. So basically, it shows America's progression from the late 19th century into the early 21st century. Kind of takes you on a very brief visual and audio history of America and then shows you how the world got to where it is when the film starts. It works well. You don't need a lot of exposition at the beginning to create your world. And in general, it immediately immerses you in this world that's being created. Now, of course, this film is trying to take you back 100 years instead of forward. But the set design, the costuming, everything else is immersive. It's well done. I didn't need to be shown where I was because you know it immediately. This is not the modern world.
I think we are aligned on that. The one thing I will say about the costuming, since you brought it up, is that I do have like a little bone to pick there. The fact, while the costuming was nice to look at and it was indicative of the 1920s, do you think, I mean, you're the history person, these are factory workers? They seemed so well dressed with all the latest fashions and they were always very clean and stylish. Like, would factory workers in the 1920s have had those levels of clothes and styling?
Yes. If you look at things like Sears catalogs from the time, you do see that the kind of fashions they wore were being marketed to mass audiences, mass consumers. So I didn't really have a problem with that. And of course, the factory work they're doing is sitting at a bench, slowly irradiating themselves. They're not like, working on a line at the Ford factory. So I thought that worked out okay. It didn't bother me.
I will say one more thing about Boring Bessie, and then we can move on to something else. That I want to take a moment to compare it to a similar themed movie, Aaron Brockovich, which is a great film starring Julia Roberts, and it focuses on the right protagonist. The film is named after the protagonist, right? And it you have an interesting character. The theme is similar. It's one woman going up against a powerful industry that's poisoning people. In Aaron Brockovich, it's specific gas and electric. And instead of it's something in the paint, it's something in the water. And the people in this town in California are drinking the water. And because of the company is dumping toxins into the groundwater, they're getting all these horrible side effects and cancer and dying. And there's an arbitration component to it. And Aaron Brockovich is, working to try to get justice for these victims. So you've got a very similar theme in terms of what the film is trying to say, but Erin Brockovich is a way more interesting character. She's this unemployed single mom of 3 who basically won't take no for an answer, and she needs a job after things don't go right in her litigation with her traffic accident. So she basically forces this lawyer to give her a job as a result, and she's just this spunky, sassy, interesting character that goes in and figures out the truth. And like that was an enjoyable film because they chose the right person to focus on. If they had focused on a lawyer or something, it would have been a much more boring film.
The film I thought of is very similar as theme to both Aaron Brockovich and Radium Girls, and that was Silkwood. So Silkwood is a Meryl Streep film from 1980. It's based on a true story sort of thing. She works in a plant that makes fuel rods for nuclear power plants. And, she, of course, finds out that corners being cut and they're being irradiated and lots of stuff happens. But like Aaron Brockovich, that had a more interesting character. It was clear why they were focusing on the character they did. It's also just a better movie.
So there's one more thing I want to bring up about the plot. So we're analyzing this as writers, and that's in using good plot devices. Plot devices are necessary to tell a story and move your story along. There's nothing wrong with them per se, but you've got to use them in an engaging way that doesn't feel forced. So this is where I want to bring up the Discovered Diary. And I found that inserting this diary as a plot device was lazy writing. So the audience is supposed to believe that, okay, so Bessie and Josephine have an older sister named Mary who died about 3 years ago. They thought it was syphilis, but of course we find out later it's from the poisoning with the paint. And so we're supposed to believe that Bessie has never looked at her diary in 3 years and conveniently starts, rummaging through her things 3 years later, and then just reads a passage about Mary being in love with Mr. Leach, who's like the factory manager, and we learn later the creator of Undark. And there's a note in the diary that says, Mr. Leach warned me not to lick the brush. The paint is poisonous. It just was so plotty. Like 3 years later, she's just now looking through her dead sister's stuff. Like, why wouldn't she have looked through it earlier and read this diary earlier? And of course, it's this line that she wrote that then leads them down the trail. It wasn't the fact that her sister is a virgin and couldn't possibly have gotten syphilis or some other reason they might start investigating this. It was this diary entry that moved them along in the story. And I just didn't think we needed the diary to get us there. You could have done a lot more interesting things to arouse their suspicions. You could have used the side characters, Walt and Etta, to like they've heard rumors about the radium paint, right? They're all into investigating and documenting mistreatment and oppression and whatnot. You could have had that. They're progressives in the know. You could have had Josephine just being bright and figuring it out herself. Like, I just hated the use of this diary. What are your thoughts, Jeff?
I agree. I think the raw material for a good story and a rational plot development is right there. Jo is getting sick, losing her teeth. She is told that she has syphilis by the company doctor. Amazingly enough, the same diagnosis that her dead sister got. you could easily have her track down one of the other girls who used to work there who is also suffering. They could put it together that there is something going on here when you find a number of women, all who have been told they have syphilis and who are all suffering from the same effects. And then they go to the Consumer League. And then your story kind of goes like that. A little bit of sleuthing actually makes your characters look smarter. Opening up a diary that basically lays everything out is lazy.
Right. Like, let me tell you exactly what's going on here by an entry that I'm going to put in this magical diary I'm going to drop into the story. And they use this diary one more time in the film, and in a way that I find annoying is so they imply through the diary that Mary and Mr. Leach have had a romantic relationship, which is a little creepy in and of itself because Mr. Leach is a much older man and Mary probably was in her late teens, right? And so Bessie goes to Mr. Leach, who is also suffering from radium poisoning, and talks about the diary to him and uses it to confront him, saying, I know you knew about Undark. And he confesses that he knew about it, that radium was dangerous, but he didn't say anything. And so she tries to use it to like guilt him to testify. But you don't, again, you didn't need the diary. She could have just gone there and said, hey, you're the manager, you're the creator of Undark. I'm assuming you knew this was dangerous given all the girls that are dying and losing their teeth and jaws. Like, she could have confronted him that way to make him feel guilty of all these, like, look how many women's deaths are on your shoulders. Like, we didn't need this contrived relationship between Mr. Leach and Mary discovered in this diary to get us there. So again, just lazy writing and a stupid plot device that was unnecessary to the story.
Yeah. Which is all unfortunate because this is an important story to tell. And I was actually looking forward to watching it because I knew what the topic was. I'm like, this should be cool. And it was not. It was bland and pretty much uninteresting. So I guess I just wrapped up my plot analysis.
So let's wrap up this film. What was the scene you liked best, Jeff?
I thought the scene where Joe is in the bathtub, loses her tooth, and Bessie is coming there talking. That was a nice understated scene. The two actresses really worked well there. It is disturbing, but not like shoved in your face disturbing. This, I don't think there's ever like a close up of the missing tooth or the tooth on the side of the bathtub, but you see it there and you're like, oh, this is what's happening to her. She's getting sick. And it was a really good launch point for what the story should have been. But I like that scene. I thought it was well done. How about you?
So I also chose a scene earlier on in the film, and I chose a scene that was at the factory. It was a midnight seance that the girls did at the factory, and I just thought it was visually a cool scene. It's them painting themselves with undark as body paint, and you see the glowing clocks all around them that have been painted, and it's like a 1920s style rave, and I liked the visual aspect of the scene, which is why I chose it.
Okay. So, what was your least favorite scene?
So there, honestly, it's a series. It's all those excerpts of the 1920s footage that they crowbarred into this movie to try to remind us that we were in the 1920s. It was interrupting, very distracting, like the girls dancing, all those scenes. I'm like, I don't care. Let's just get back to the story about what's happening to these women that we're following. It didn't help the film become more authentically 1920s in my mind. I think the opening, you could have done some 1920s footage in to set the tone and then leave it at that. You didn't need any other scenes interjected. What about you, Jeff?
I really wanted to briefly mention something related to what you just said. It's a nitpick thing, but I'm going to draw attention to it. There is a scene near the end where the Radium Girls are leaving a courthouse, and Etta, our documentarian, is filming them. And you see from the point of view of the camera, so it's in black and white. And the film is scratched, and I immediately was like, you numpties, film from the 1920s didn't come pre-scratched. It's scratched because it's old. If she's filming this, it should be pristine black and white. But okay, that's just that's the film snob in me coming out. Yeah.
Amateurs.
But as far as the worst scene, I found everything having to do with the communist subplot to be unnecessary. But the jailhouse discussion between Etta and Bessie was very preachy, very on the nose, and really seemed like it was two women talking in 2017, not 1927.
Yeah, that was an odd, like that whole subplot was odd. I agree. Because the dialogue didn't feel like it fit the period at times.
If it had played an integral role in the story, I would have been okay with that. But it didn't, and it just ate up time that could have been better used with something else. Anything else you want to say, or shall we get on to our panda rating?
Let's get on to the panda rating.
Okay, Steph, on a scale of 0 to 5, with 5 being the most amazing celestial pandas ever put on film, how many pandas would you give this?
Yeah, not so many. I gave this 2 pandas. Really interesting topic, an important topic, but poorly executed. It is a watered down telling of what happened to these women, and the tone of the film was off. It didn't feel dark and heavy enough for what was happening to these women. We didn't get enough graphic scenes of like their teeth and their jaws, and like it was there's too much like light scenes of flappers in the 1920s for a film that should have had a darker tone. So it missed the mark on the tone and not to in my mind getting graphic enough with what was happening to these women and their bodies. Like people's jaws literally fell out. And totally misses the mark on choosing the wrong protagonist. It should have been Josephine, not Bessie. I give it points for the subject matter because it is an interesting topic and caused me to do some internet rabbit hole research to learn more about what happened to these women. And I liked the costuming. I thought it was nice. But I overall I'd skip this and read the book or do some internet research on this topic to learn about it, but you don't need to watch this film to learn about it. What about you, Jeff?
So I also gave this movie to irradiated teenage pandas, and for mostly the same reasons. It's an interesting topic, but it's ruined by poor execution and a mistaken focus for the protagonist. Yeah, and I would also recommend skipping it.
Thanks for listening to us analyze Radium Girls. Jeff, what do we have coming up next week?
So next week, we'll be reviewing In a Lonely Place, currently streaming on Amazon. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Wrights Media. Reproduction without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2021.